Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Adult Bible Fellowship. I've got my ABF shirt on that I like to wear when I do my teaching, and hopefully I'll only have to do this once. Those of you in the second service got to hear about me doing it 3 times last week, but we'll get it worked out. It'll sort itself out. I want to remind you that the notes for this session are available online. If you go to fbchh.org, the resource tab, about halfway down, ABF notes. They should cover last week's study and also this week's. And my hope and my prayer is that we'll get through the rest of this information today, and then next week we'll dive into some new material that hopefully will be a benefit and a help to you. So we've been talking about how to understand biblical prophecy, because it's really, really, really important that we follow the storyteller's lead, the prophet's lead, and interpret his prophecies the way he would want us to interpret them, right? It's such a danger when it comes to end-time prophecies, because we have so many questions we want to ask the text, so many things we're curious about. We are tempted with regularity, I believe, to superimpose on a biblical prophecy what we think or what we see or what we want to know. And sometimes, too, we bring in information from way further down the history track, hundreds of years later, and bring it back into this passage, especially in the Old Testament, that, well, at least we do that way too soon. And so what I want us to do is to learn, when we're reading Old Testament prophecy or New Testament prophecy, anytime anything's related to the end times or things that are going to happen in the future, that we subject ourselves to a pretty rigorous process of understanding and coming to grips with what does this actually mean, okay? And last week, I kind of introduced that idea by sharing 3 core convictions or 3 beliefs about biblical storytellers, especially as it relates to prophecy. Number 1, the storyteller has a point to make. In other words, these aren't just random utterances. Somebody's taken over by the Spirit and writes down a bunch of mumbo jumbo they don't understand. The storyteller, when he wrote his prophecy, he had a point to make in that prophecy. Secondly, he wants his audience to get that point. In other words, he's not trying to deliberately hide it. This is not some kind of secret code, some mystery that God has fun hiding from us. He wants us to know it. And so the writer is going to write it down in such a way that we can come to an understanding of what it is the storyteller wants to communicate. And then the third thing is that I believe that the storyteller has given us enough information in the text itself for us to understand the point. Now, you may have to refer to older Old Testament passages to kind of get context for it, to understand it. And you certainly are going to have to do some work on the back end if there's other additional prophecies that come later, and we have to filter all that stuff together. But the text itself is where we need to look for answers. You don't need to go looking in other studies and in just the imaginations of the teacher. You need to go back to the text. So there is a point. The storyteller wants you to understand the point, so he's left clues for you to understand that point. And there's enough information in the text he's written for you to get his point. Obviously, there may not be enough information in the text for us to have all of our questions answered, but at the very least, I believe if we work hard with this process, we can come to understand what the storyteller, what the prophet was up to, what he was trying to communicate, and at least get his main point. And then from there, if we can answer some of our questions, great. And if not, we may just have to leave them unanswered. In fact, I've got a ton of questions still about the end times, but I think I've got a fairly good grasp on what Scripture has to say, even if it's just in general terms about what's coming. We'll get to that in just a little bit. Then we ended last week by looking at the very first sort of point or first step in this process of understanding prophecy from a biblical perspective. And the first step is this: ask the text, what does it seem to be saying right on the surface, right? That the normal, common sense, plain, this is the way the word is used kind of understanding is the one you go with, unless the author tips his hand or gives you clues in the text that he wants you to understand his words in a figurative or in an allegorical or a metaphorical way. In other words, go with the bottom line, common sense understanding of these words, unless he tells you in the text itself not to do so. And the key thing along the way is to understand, what did these words mean to the original audience that they were given to, right? So whatever the words meant to them, that's where we start. That's our starting point. What did they understand when they heard the words Israel, when they heard the word forever, when they heard the word nation? What are the understandings of their minds? And then from there, we can extrapolate over the centuries and the millennia to where we sit. Now, I'm not saying that's always easy, but that's a good place to start. Jeremiah 31 was the example that we finished with last week. And in Jeremiah 31, it sure seems to say that in order for Israel to lose its place before God as a nation, the sun, moon, and stars are going to have to disappear. And as long as the sun, moon, and stars have not disappeared, then we ought to expect that the nation of Israel, the physical descendants of Abraham, are going to have a place in God's plan for the rest of time, forever. That's what the text says. That's what it says on the surface. That's the plain understanding of these words. And there's really no clues or hints in the text itself that you're supposed to understand that in some kind of non-literal, figurative, metaphorical, allegorical way. And so let's just stick with what it says. Let's hold on to what it says unless the text itself makes it clear to us that it means something a little bit different, which is what brings me to part 2, or step number 2. Once you've asked that question of the prophet and you say, hey, prophet, how are you trying to help me understand prophecy? And he says, well, look, first look on the surface. But then every now and then, step 2, you're going to realize that the storyteller has left clues that you ought to take his words in a figurative way. And that's what we're going to spend our time thinking and talking about today. So, what are these clues? What kind of clues will you see? And if you're filling in blanks as you're going along, I got a couple for you to fill in here, okay? What kind of clues will the storyteller leave behind in the text itself that will tell you that you're supposed to understand his words figuratively or non-literally? Okay, usually 2 things, okay? Number 1 is figurative language. That's the first blank there. Figurative language, or another way of saying that, is figures of speech. Speech is the final blank in that line there. So what are the clues we're looking for? So as you're reading a prophecy, you have to be careful. You have to look closely for figures of speech or figurative language. But here's the thing. Once you find one, and you will find them often because prophets use figures of speech and abstract language all the time. That happens, okay? But that doesn't mean we all of a sudden chuck all the rules out the window. Because the truth is, even when you're using a figure of speech, you are referring to something specific, right? If I use a figurative speech in my thing, I say, I feel wiped out. I used this illustration last week. Wiped out, okay? Wiped out, if you trace the etymology of where that expression came from, the idea is I feel rubbed out, I feel erased, I feel like I'm gone, I feel like I'm done. Well, and you can very easily jump from that idea to really super tired and exhausted, right? So you sit down on the couch, obviously you're still there, so literally you're not wiped out. But the expression wiped out refers to a concrete thing, which is I feel exhausted. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, okay, how do we take these figures of speech and from them derive something concrete? That's what our next set of blanks is, and I want to share them with you, and then I'm going to try to illustrate it from another passage in the book of Revelation. Yay, Revelation, we're getting there today. Okay, ready? So it says, if there are figures of speech that you find in your text, if so, then seek the concrete meaning behind the abstract figure of speech. The concrete meaning behind the abstract figure of speech. Okay? A figure of speech may be figurative and it may be allegorical, but it's going to point to something real. Okay? If I say my sweetheart, and you don't understand how the English language works, and you go, sweet heart. Your heart, that's the thing that pumps in your chest. It's sweet. Have you been eating too much sugar? Is that affecting your blood? And all that stuff. And you say, no. I'm not talking about an organ in my body that is pumping, and it's pumping because of sugar that has affected it. I'm talking about a sweetheart is someone who I love, someone who I have affection for, my girlfriend. And in my case, my girlfriend is also my wife. Sweetheart, it's an expression, it's a figure of speech. So the concrete thing is not my organ in my chest. I'm using the organ in my chest figuratively to describe a person who has my heart, a person who I love desperately, okay? Even the expression has my heart is a figure of speech, right? Because my wife doesn't literally have my heart in a box at our house, but she controls my emotions and she affects my emotions. Why? Because I love her very much. And so we use this expression figuratively. Well, if I'm learning English from another language, I have to try to figure out, what is this figure of speech pointing to? Is it pointing to an organ inside the body, or is it pointing to a beautiful woman who lives in Millport, New York, who I happen to love very much? And if you were to ask me as the original storyteller, when I told you that story, which is it? Which concrete thing are you pointing to? I would say, guess what? I'm pointing to the woman who lives in Millport, not the physical organ inside my chest. We have to do something similar with biblical prophecy. These words that may seem figurative and I don't know what it's referring to, we got to figure out, okay, fine. There's a figure of speech here. He doesn't intend for us to read it literally. Okay, fine. But what is it referring to? Because I think we can figure this out. Most of the time, we can figure out what he's pointing to and coming up with that concrete thing that's underneath the abstract concept on top. All right? And I'm going to try to show you what I'm talking about in the next section or the next passage. So let me keep going and give you a couple blanks, because if I don't give you your blanks, I know there's going to be some people that complain. So here we go. In other words, figures of speech are pointing to something specific, that's the blank, that we should be able to properly understand. So even if the figure of speech is a little bit out there, the figure of speech, once you understand what it's referring to, you can figure out what he's talking about. All right? Figures of speech, and we do this all the time in our everyday life. But sometimes when we come to Scripture, because the figures of speech are not English figures of speech from the 21st century, we throw up our hands and say, I could never understand this. And the truth is you can if you're willing to do a little bit of work. If you're doing a little bit of work to understand the biblical author and the way he's coming from, you can take these figures of speech that seem so weird and scary, and you can come down and bore down a little bit, and you can come to the concrete thing he's talking about. Now, sometimes you need some help with that. That's fine. But sometimes just your own intuition or your own study of Scripture or comparing this passage to other passages, you can come to understand what he's talking about. So let me dive in, okay? On your notes, I think it's page 9. You're going to see something that at the top says, the woman and the dragon. Okay, now you know we're into something figurative, right? So it's Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. And this is a passage that I think gives some really, really clear hints in the text itself that the storyteller wants us to understand this scene as a figurative scene and not a literal scene. It's not something that's literally happening in front of him. It's some kind of a symbolic, figurative description of other events that have already happened in human history. And I'm going to try to get to that and understand it why. So find page 9 and then open up, and I'm just going to read the first few verses of this. And then we're going to ask ourselves some questions. And I might write them on the board because I haven't done that in a couple weeks and I miss it. And if everybody was here, we could do that and that would be fun. But anyway, here we go. Verse 1. You ready? And a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Can I just stop there? I'm just going to stop there, all right? So here we go. What is the first hint in this text that he wants us to understand this as a figurative thing and not a literal thing? Okay? And if you pointed out that the first 4 words are the first clue, then you are absolutely right. What does he say appeared in heaven? He says a great sign appeared in heaven. A great sign appeared in heaven. What is he trying to do? He's trying to give you as many clues as he possibly can that this thing he's about to describe to you was some kind of a vision. It's a figurative thing. Don't take everything 100% literally. He's actually telling you in the text, verse 1, the very first 3 or 4 words. That's the kind of clue we're talking about. It's like this red flashing light that says, figurative, take your time, don't go super fast, think this one through, baby. It's going to take a little bit of work. Ready? So what's the first part of this sign that he sees in heaven, right? He sees a woman. Now, you see a woman. Aha. Well, that's pretty concrete, right? I mean, that's pretty obvious. A woman, you all can close your eyes and you can imagine a woman. Your mother, your sister, your wife, your cousin, your coworker. We know what women are. We're blessed to see them all the time. A woman. And yet, hold on a second, this woman may not represent a single solitary person. Why? Because we already know we're dealing with this is a sign. And now let's look at how this woman is described. How is this woman described? Well, she's described as being clothed with the sun. All right? So that's description number 1. Clothed with the sun. Now, how does that work? The sun is pretty big. The sun is millions of miles away. You can't wrap yourself in the sun if you're a human, right? What happens if you're a human woman and you clothe yourself with the sun? You vaporize before you get within several million miles of the sun, right? We can't handle the heat. So if there's a woman clothed with the sun, we know he's talking about something figurative. Now, we don't have enough information yet to know exactly what he's talking about, but let's keep reading, okay? So she's clothed with the sun, and the moon was under her feet. Moon under feet. Now, again, moon's far away. Moon is big. A person can step on the moon, but this seems to imply that the moon is like this small thing underneath the feet of this particular woman. Now, it also implies, by the way, under the feet is a biblical expression to talk about authority, right? If your enemies are under your feet, that means you have conquered over them. You've triumphed over them. So there's some sense of authority over the moon itself. Authority over the moon. That's kind of a big deal. Clothed with the sun. This at the very least speaks of power, right? And splendor. In some ways, she's dazzling. She's clothed with the sun, dazzling. Her moon is under her feet. And what is she wearing on her head? On her head, she's wearing a crown of 12 stars. Now, if you want to take this as like a little metal picture of a star, then I suppose this could be literal, right? A woman could wear a crown on her head that has 12 metal stars around it. But if sun and moon seem to imply the actual bodies out there, the heavenly bodies, then maybe what he's saying, and it seems more likely to fit in with the other things, that the crown actually has 12 stars on her crown. This is not literal language. No woman can wear a crown that has 12 stars on it. It just doesn't work. So what in the world is he talking about here? This is where you have to do a little work. You got to think this through. Biblical writers oftentimes take symbolism from earlier stories, in the Old Testament especially, that set the understanding of who these things are and who these people are. and they bring those symbols into present prophecies. I don't know if it's to save time or if it's just to refer to those things in a way. So yeah, you sort of have to know earlier in the story, but it's not like this is in some hidden tablet somewhere in some coffin in some pyramid, and you have to be like Indiana Jones and go find it, and only the people that go find it and read it in Egyptian or whatever are able to find this out. If you know the Old Testament, you can sort of understand what this is saying. Now, here's the part that's interesting. If you've read a lot of the Old Testament stories, especially the book of Genesis, this sun, moon, and stars thing, especially with this number, 12 stars. 12 stars, right? It's not 13 stars. It's not 14 stars. It's not 6 stars. It's 12 stars. Your head should be sort of thinking this through, right? Sun, moon, and 12 stars. Where have I heard that before? And then your head... And if we were all in this room right now, I would ask you to help me out. Where have you heard this before? Because biblical storytellers, right? They love to build on previous stories. They love to take your knowledge of older stories and work it into their story so that you can kind of understand it more fully, right? So sun, moon, 12 stars. That actually emerges from a dream that a pretty famous kid had before he was shipped off to Egypt to be a slave. So I'm going to encourage you really quick to open up your copy of the Bible to Genesis, and I think you're going to want to go to Genesis 36. Genesis 36, or maybe it's 37. Yes, Genesis 37, okay? Genesis 37, I want to show you something. Verse 9. It says in Genesis 37, verse 9, then he, this is, the he, by the way, is, let's see, I'm always losing my pens. See, this is how you know we're like duplicating ABF, is I lose my pens, I throw things, you know. So, there's this kid named Joseph. Okay? And he's a dreamer. And these dreams seem to not just be like the dreams you and I have that are like disconnected bits of reality kind of jumbled together into this omelet that we call a dream. Joseph seems to be getting messages from God in a symbolic way during his sleep. And they stick with him when he wakes up. And he feels compelled to share this with his dad, his mom, and his brothers. And here's what the text says in verse 9. Then he, Joseph, dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers. Oh, and by the way, if you go back and you take a look, I'm not sure if it says here. Joseph is one of 12 brothers. That's important. Verse 9. Then he dreamed, this is Joseph, another dream, and told it to his brothers. How many? 11. And then add him, that's 12. And said, behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Catch that? The sun, the moon, and 11 stars. Now, how does his dad understand the interpretation of this dream? Look at verse 10. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow themselves to the ground before you? So how does his dad interpret this dream? Okay, to Joseph, the sun is his dad. The moon is his mom. The stars are his brothers. Now, this is particularly interesting when you find out who Joseph's dad, mom, and brothers were. Okay, right? Joseph's dad is a guy by the name of Jacob. Joseph's mom was Jacob's favorite wife, a lady by the name of Rachel. Joseph's brothers, and I'm not going to go and list all their names because frankly I might not get one and then you guys would laugh at me, but his brothers become the 11 tribes of Israel. Jacob is actually renamed by God later on in his life, Israel. And they are the fountain, the source from which proceeds the physical descendants of Abraham. The entire nation of Israel comes from this family unit right here. And Joseph had a dream, sun, moon, 11 stars came about. And Jacob understood what he's talking about. He's like, dude, are you saying that your mom and me and your brothers are going to come bow before you? Of course, we know how the story ends up, right? Like Jacob, that's exactly what happens. Joseph goes down to Egypt. He does his thing. He saves Egypt from famine. And in the process, basically gets adopted as an Egyptian by the Pharaoh. His brothers come to him looking for food, not knowing it's him. And they bow down before him, right? And he has this huge deja vu moment, right? Oh my gosh, I had this dream and look, there it is. Later on, his mom sadly dies before she has a chance to come. But either way, what Joseph's dream is saying is that your family is going to be submissive to you, Joseph. You're going to lead your family. And that's exactly what happens in that dream. But then the writer to Revelation, John, grabs this image from Genesis 37, and now he's applying it to this sign that he sees. This sign he sees in the sky. And what does he see? He sees a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of not 11 stars. That was Joseph's dream. This is 12 stars. Why 12 stars? Because Joseph is the 12th star. This is a figurative way to describe the physical nation of Israel. It's figuratively taking the entire nation, men, women, and children, and lumping them together into one singular figure that now he's going to use to tell something about what has happened and something that will happen, okay? So we know, we've done the homework. We did sun, moon, and stars. We traced it back to Genesis 37, and we know that this woman refers to the nation of Israel. Not one woman from Israel, but the woman represents the entire nation, everybody. And you can do that because this is figurative. It's not literal. It's a symbol. Even the symbol has something concrete it's pointing to, a nation of people, okay? Now, that's first part. So go back to Revelation 12. And this will help us even more to make sure that our interpretation is accurate. Verse 2 says, she was pregnant. That's interesting. And was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. So that's actually pretty significant. Let's go ahead and put it down here. Pregnant. This is going to become important in John's vision or his sign that he sees in heaven. Later on, it's going to help us to know that we have correctly interpreted this woman as referring to Israel. Okay? Now, let's keep reading. Verse 3. Right? You're with me? And another sign appeared in heaven. So again, any clues in that phrase? Yes. Once again, he repeats sign. 2 times now, he said, look, I'm about to say something, and I need you to take it figuratively. First of all, I saw a woman clothed with the sun, moon under her feet, 12 stars on her head. This is a woman who is going to represent the nation of Israel. Now we see a new sign in heaven, and you and I should already be prepared for the fact that we're going to have to interpret whatever he sees in a non-literal, figurative way, but then we have to do the work to know what it is that that's physically referring to, concretely referring to. What is it that we see? We see not a woman, we see a red dragon. Now, let's not call him Smaug, okay? That's for all you Tolkien fans out there. The red dragon in this case is not Smaug. That would be a physical thing that's pointing to, okay? A great red dragon. Now, let's talk about this. He's got 7 heads. He's got 10 horns. And what else does it say about him? And on his heads, 7 diadems. So 7 heads, and I'll just say with crowns. and 10 horns. 7 heads, 10 horns. Now, let's keep going. Verse 4. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. All right. That's strange, right? First of all, we have a dragon. A dragon is a mythical creature. Sure, there may be some evidence that fire-breathing reptiles existed on the planet. If you do some work with Answers in Genesis, they point to certain historical artifacts that suggest that maybe that was true. But let's assume that he's not necessarily talking about a literal animal that roamed the earth. He's speaking figuratively of this fire-breathing dragon, right? And it's got heads with crowns. That means that this dragon has a certain amount of authority. Okay? If you do your homework and look back in the Old Testament, anytime you have a mythical beast that has multiple horns on it, those tend to refer to specific rulers. And if I had time, I'd go back to Daniel. In fact, we'll hit Daniel a little bit later on in this study. Daniel talks about horns representing kind of like leaders in a nation of people, right? So he's got 10 horns, he's got 7 heads with crowns, he's a figure of authority. But let's not try to plug in too much, because I'm not sure we've gathered enough information yet. Verse 4, his tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. Now look at this part. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might what? Devour it. So what you see next in this vision is you notice that the woman and the dragon, right, are enemies. They are enemies. The dragon is waiting. He's like right there. This poor woman is giving birth. She's about to have a baby at any moment. She's like in the throes of birth pangs. And there's this evil, scary red dragon who is ready and willing. And what is he about to do? He's about to devour the child that is going to be born. So they're enemies from the get-go. Who is the enemy of the nation of Israel? Who has been trying to destroy her from day one? And let's just go a little bit further. Verse 5. She gave birth to a male child. She gives birth to a male child. A male child. One who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Rule nations with rod of iron. Now who's that? Who is that? Once again, if you do your homework, you look at that expression, you realize John has just quoted an Old Testament passage. Rod of iron. Who is going to rule with a rod of iron? The person who's going to rule with a rod of iron is specifically Messiah. And who do we know, and who does John know, and who does John want you to believe is that Messiah? That Messiah is, of course, Jesus himself. Now, some people might say, well, maybe the woman is Mary. Maybe it refers to Mary, Jesus' mother. It's possible, but I disagree, and I don't think so. Because these other clues here, the sun, moon, and stars, seems to be calling attention to the nation as a whole, not one particular woman that is like a superwoman or something. Like a lot of times the Roman Catholic teaching on how special and important Mary is, and she's almost like semi-divine in the way they talk about her. They call her the Queen of Heaven and stuff like that. Like that's probably taking some figurative thing to describe an entire nation and applying it to one person from that nation in an inappropriate way. All right, so I wouldn't go there. I certainly would not go there. What I would say, though, is you have this dragon. He's the enemy of Israel, and that dragon was trying to devour and destroy Jesus from the very moment he was born. Do you remember the really disturbing, upsetting part of the Christmas story where the wise men come to find and to worship the one who was born the King of the Jews? Do you remember where they stopped first? They stopped in Jerusalem because they figured that's probably where the next king would be born, is in the capital. And they go to Herod the Great, and they say, "Hey, Herod, we've come to worship the new king." And Herod's like, "Didn't know there was a new king." And they hunt it down, he hunts it down, and oh yeah, the Messiah was going to be born in Bethlehem. And so he sends them on to Bethlehem. If you remember this, he sends them on to Bethlehem, and he says, "Hey, once you find the Messiah, come on back and tell me, and then I'm going to go and worship him too." But the Magi, the wise men, were warned in a dream that this was basically a lie. And so they left to go home without going back to Jerusalem. And Herod didn't find out for probably a few weeks that they had gone. Do you remember what Herod did? Herod decided immediately that the only way he could know for sure that he had gotten rid of the Messiah is if he kills all the babies in Bethlehem 2 years old and younger. So if you can imagine this, they go house to house in this little village of Bethlehem, and it's not a big town, it's not a big city. Don't picture like a big metropolis. This is like a small community, but there's probably lots of moms with little boys, and they're all wiped out. They're all gone. The night before Herod unleashes these troops, an angel warns Joseph this is going to happen, and Joseph and Mary take the baby Jesus and they escape to Egypt. And that's the only reason that Jesus wasn't killed as an infant in Bethlehem by Herod. So if you know that story, which I think John is assuming, probably most people who are reading the book of Revelation are familiar with the story of Jesus and the killing of the innocent babies in Bethlehem, then all of a sudden you go, what is being described here? What's being described here is something very concrete, but it's being described in a very abstract way. You have Israel, the woman Israel, representing all the people, and Israel gives birth to a baby. And that baby is a male child, the Messiah, who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. Again, another quote from an Old Testament passage talking about Messiah. And we all need to fill in the blanks, if you've been reading John at all, to know that's Jesus. And if you go, oh my gosh, I remember that story. And then when Jesus was a young boy, when he was probably less than 2 years old, somebody, a red dragon, Herod the Great, tried to kill Jesus. And then you go, oh, wait a minute, there's 10 horns here. Maybe what that means is that this red dragon is like the spirit that's behind all of these powers and authorities that are trying to destroy Jesus. That maybe these horns and heads represent political figures that are under the control of the red dragon, whatever spirit that's talking about. And these figures are constantly in the process of trying to destroy Jesus. Now, we find out in verse 5 that the dragon's effort was unsuccessful, right? Her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Well, we also know that that's true, right? The Bible tells us that when Jesus died and was raised to life again, that at one point, 40 days later, he was raised up. He was taken up into the presence of God. He was caught up to God and to his throne. So far, this fits perfectly everything that has happened so far in the story. So really, verses 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, those are all events that have happened already in the past. Verses 1 through 5 have happened in the past. So why in the world does John use this if he's talking about the future? Well, it's because of verse 6. He's looking back he's retelling the story of the past in a figurative way because he wants to carry that figure on to describe what's going to happen in the future. So now that we kind of know who the main players are, okay, the red dragon is some evil spirit that's behind all of these human kings and authorities who have been trying to destroy Jesus from the time of his birth, even though Jesus was saved from them and was caught up to God and his throne. Now we have these two figures that are left, the woman and the dragon. They're still around and they have a future. Take a look at verse 6. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. 1,260 days. Now, here we're tempted to, this is where it gets interesting. Because you're like, okay, wait a minute. When did this happen? And you go, oh, well, I guess that hasn't happened yet, right? The entire nation of Israel has not gone into hiding in the wilderness for 1,260 days, which if I do my math correctly, I think that is 3.5 years, okay? 3.5 years, 1,260 days. So the question becomes, okay, are there any hints, right? The two questions you have on your sheet. Are there any hints that the storyteller leaves to suggest that he expects you to take his words in a figurative way, right? Yes. The sign that's repeated twice, the figurative language about the woman clothed with the sun, moon under her feet, right? The echoes back to Joseph's dream in Genesis 37. Verse 3, there's another hint, another sign appeared, right? Then there's also verse 5, a reference to Psalm 2. The rule the nations with a rod of iron is a reference to Psalm 2. And Psalm 2 is a messianic psalm talking about that. We know it connects to Jesus. So those are the hints. There's hints all through this that we need to understand this in a figurative way. But then it says, what does his figurative language refer to? How do we know that the storyteller intended what he intended you to think of? The woman, I believe, is the nation of Israel. I think it's pretty clear that the abstract figures of speech point specifically to the nation as a whole. Then also the dragon. How do we know who the dragon is? Well, Genesis 12. You're already in Revelation 12, right? Just look a couple verses further down. Because once this woman escapes into the wilderness, he has an absolute hissy fit. Revelation chapter 12, verse 7. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down. Okay, so who is this great dragon? That ancient serpent. Whoa, hold on a second here. Ancient serpent. What does that make me think of? The serpent in the Garden of Eden. So wait a minute. The serpent that led Adam and Eve to sin against God all those millennia ago, that serpent was the same figure that tried to destroy Jesus when Jesus was born? Hold on. You're kidding me? The same spirit at work across those millennia of time? Yes. And then he makes it more specific. Verse 9. That ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. So John makes it incredibly clear who he believes the dragon is, right? The woman, I believe, is Israel. He doesn't call her by name, but I think the sun, moon, and stars is a very clear reference to Israel. But how about this red dragon? He makes it very clear. He calls him by name. He's Satan, the ancient serpent. And then you're like, oh, it makes perfect sense, actually. It makes perfect sense because Satan, through his demons, were always interfering with Jesus in his ministry. Satan was tempting Jesus to walk away from his ministry. Satan was provoking Judas to betray Jesus and to have Jesus killed. Of course, Satan's been trying to destroy Jesus from day one. Of course. And so what better way to describe this evil spirit being that's out there, that's been fighting against good and leading mankind to disobedience ever since the dawn of human history in Genesis chapter 3? What better way to describe him than a giant red dragon who wants to destroy other people, who has 7 heads and 10 horns. He has all these political figures under his control that he's going to now weaponize to destroy God, God's people, and God's Messiah. Got it. Now, some of the other stuff he describes in that chapter we can come back to later. Okay, and I'm not 100% sure exactly when the timeline of all these things are. All I know is that Satan is the dragon, and John makes it really, really clear that that's who Satan is. But either way, I'm jumping later into the story here. So far, we're just talking about this concept, right? And this concept is that there are going to be times when prophecies have figurative language. And that's fine. There's no problem with that. That's just the way it is. Totally cool. As long as you do the work of figuring out what do these things refer to. Now, you may do the best work you can and still not be 100% sure, okay? That's when I encourage you to keep reading, because a lot of times as you continue to read and this character or this thing is continued to be described, you can kind of come to some conclusions and draw more observations about what it's concretely referring to. But there are times, even then, you may struggle to figure that out. Okay? But either way, the text itself is the one that's sending us the message, hey, figure of speech here, figure of speech. Don't freak out. It's okay. It's all good. So, notice this next blank here, this next subpoint. If there is no figurative language, then take his statements at face value. If he doesn't use figures of speech, then he's trying to be plain and clear. And you should expect that to make sense. When he says he saw God seated upon his throne in Revelation 4. Well, God seated on his throne, those are not figurative phrases. Those are not figurative terms. God, we know who he's referring to because we've read the entire story so far. The God of the universe, the creator God who spoke the worlds into existence, seated on his throne. The Bible says that God has a throne. He has a home. He has a place where he rules from. And so that's what you should picture in your head, and that's perfectly fine. It's only when these figures of speech come in here that we have to kind of do a little bit extra work to figure out what he's referring to. Now, I have an example that I'm going to share with you to wrap this up over the next 10 minutes or so, that is actually one that we have to be careful about, because one of the things that we tend to be impatient about is we really like to connect dots between passages that maybe the text itself does not send the message that we ought to take and connect those passages together. All right, so we've been talking about the red dragon, Satan, right? Satan, there's very little information about Satan in the Old Testament. If you want information about Satan, you really have to start in the ministry of Jesus and in the teachings of the apostles, because Satan is a figure, he's a force, he does pop up from time to time, there are evil spirits, and that's all very clear in the Old Testament. But all of the delineations and the order and the hierarchy and all that stuff, all the stuff we're really curious about, that stuff doesn't really come much from the Old Testament. However, there is a lot of figurative speech in the Old Testament. And so sometimes what people want to do is take examples of these figurative speech and they want to connect it to and give us more information about Satan, even when the text doesn't necessarily justify it. Let me give you the classic example. When I went to Bible college and I was learning about angels and demons, Isaiah chapter 14 was listed as a description of Satan, specifically Satan's fall from being a good angel to a bad angel. Okay? And so Isaiah 14 is where we're going to go for just a couple of minutes, and then we're going to wrap up for today. So it looks like we're going to have to finish this up a little bit next week as well. Isaiah 14, and here we go, starting in verse 12. If you start in verse 12, then it's tempting to see this description as describing Satan's fall from grace, or fall from goodness, at least, at the side of God as one of God's good angels. Verse 12 says this: "How you have fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Now, you read that, and that sounds almost exactly like what Satan must have said in his heart when he was a good angel, and then he decided to rebel and try to take God's place. You could totally see Satan saying that. Plus, you have this expression, fallen from heaven, which if you've read Revelation 12, you know that Satan the red dragon gets cast down to earth. And you're like, oh, he's fallen from heaven, day star, son of the dawn. Maybe that's referring to Satan when he was still like a good angel, like a bright, shining good angel. And then there's all these descriptions of what he said in his heart. And you're like, oh, that's Satan. And so I've had this passage taught to me as describing Satan and Satan's motivations. I've heard sermons about it. Except the text itself does not say that this is Satan. And there's really a lot of other clues in this text that it's not referring to Satan in the least. Now, why is this important? Because we're trying to build an idea of how to understand prophecy. Okay? Isaiah 14, 12 through 14 is only a small section in a much larger prophecy. And it's really, really good to read in context, to read everything. Because sometimes things at the information like about stuff in the middle, there's information at the beginning or information at the end that helps you understand the part in the middle. Go back with me to Isaiah 14 verse 3. Ready? Isaiah 14 verse 3. Or actually, let's go back to verse 1. It says, "For the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and will again choose Israel and will set them in their own land." That's pretty clear, right? Like that's pretty literal. There's not a lot of figures of speech there, right? The Lord will feel strong feelings of compassion for Jacob and will again choose Israel and will set them in their own land. That means the descendants, physical descendants of Abraham, will be settled by God in their own land, which is the promised land, right? And sojourners will join them and will attach themselves to the house of Jacob. In other words, people from all the surrounding nations will be like, we want in on this. What do we have to do to be a part of this, right? Verse 2. "And the peoples will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them in the Lord's land as male and female slaves." We'll talk about that some other time. Don't worry about it right now. "They will take captive those who were their captors and rule over those who oppress them." So what you see is an oppressed group of people called the Israelites. God says, someday I'm going to take them, I'm going to feel bad for them, I'm going to put them back in their land, and then they're going to rule over the very same people who ruled over them, right? Like comeuppance like nothing you've ever seen, like revenge is sweet, right? Because the very people who are oppressing me, now I'm the one in authority over them. It's very Joseph-like, right? Joseph gets thrown into a pit, and he gets taken down to Egypt, and he seems to be the one that everybody is in charge of. But then gradually he becomes the second in command of Egypt, and the very people who oppressed him are now begging him for a favor, right? That must have been an incredible feeling. And that's what's going to happen to the nation of Israel. Now look at verse 3. "When the Lord has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and the hard service with which you were made to serve, you will take up this taunt against" who? "The king of Babylon." Now, Babylon is an actual place. King is an actual title of the person who's in charge of the kingdom of Babylon. So when he says this, when God finally takes you from being oppressed, settles you in your own land, and now you're ruling over the people who were oppressing you, then you're going to taunt the king of Babylon with this taunt. So in other words, who is the taunt for? Is it for Satan? Some demon power that we've not heard anything from in this text? Or has Isaiah told us exactly who this is for? This is for the king of Babylon. And look what he says in verse 4. "How the oppressor has ceased. The insolent fury ceased." The oppressor, Babylon was oppressing God's people, and one day the roles will be reversed and they will be under the authority of Israel. So he says, how the oppressor, king of Babylon, has ceased. Verse 5, the Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers that struck the peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. Who's he talking about? Obviously, he's talking about the king of Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon that had oppressed God's people, right? And beaten them down with unceasing blows. So we're still talking about Babylonians and the king of Babylon. Verse 7, the whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. The cypresses rejoice at you. The cedars of Lebanon saying, since you were laid low, no woodcutter comes up against us. Using figurative language again. He's saying now that Babylon is sort of like laid low, now that Babylon is no longer a world power, they don't have armies coming to chop down their forests to build their palaces and build all their homes and build all their weapons of war, stuff like that. They're like, phew, we're finally getting a break because Babylon, the nation of Babylon, the king of Babylon, they used to oppress the world, is now brought low, is now humbled, and now finally the earth will get some rest. Verse 9. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. Sheol is the place of the dead. To get there, you have to be a human who has died. This is the prevailing understanding in the Old Testament about what the afterlife is. When you die, the Bible in the Old Testament says, you go to a place called Sheol, which seems to be a temporary residence for the spirits of the dead. Okay, it doesn't really talk about, the good side, which is paradise, versus the bad side, which is hell. It sort of just lumps it all together as one giant waiting room for eternity. But that's where humans go. Satan doesn't go there. His demons don't go there. Humans go there when they die. Sheol is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth. Who's he talking about? The king of Babylon, who has been killed in the course of their nation being humbled because they used to be wicked and oppressive. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. Again, not using figurative language. He's talking about human kings of the nations. Verse 10, all of them will answer and say to you, you too have become as weak as we. You've become like us. In other words, the lowest of the low humans, when they die, go to Sheol. And the highest of the high, most powerful, oppressive people in the world, when they die, guess where they go? The exact same place. And now the people who are already in Sheol say, ha ha, you thought you were greater. You thought you were exempt. You're a man just like us. You're dead just like we are. Verse 11, your pomp is brought down to Sheol, the place of the dead, the sound of your harps. Maggots are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covers. So far, it's really clear that he's talking to a nation of physical people with a leader who's physical. And now in verse 12, with no red flags to say otherwise, he says, how you have fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn. He's being sarcastic. He's like, you king of Babylon, you thought you were all that. You thought you were an angel. You thought you were going to be higher than God itself. And instead, what has happened? You're dead, and you're now down in the place of the dead with all the other peon humans who you used to oppress. And so all the stuff that he says in his heart is human arrogance to exalt himself before the God of the Bible. He's a human king, and now God is putting him in his place, and his place is in the place of the dead. Now, if you read past verse 14, you continue to see he's talking about a human ruler. Verse 15, you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit, like he just said before. Verse 16, those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the demonic spirit who made the earth tremble? Is that what it says? No. Is this the man who made the earth tremble? Who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities, who did not let his prisoners go home. All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb, but you are cast out, away from your grave like a loathed branch, clothed with the slain, those pierced by the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit, like a dead body trampled underfoot. You will not be joined with them in burial, because you have destroyed your land, you have slain your people. Now, I could keep going, because this taunt against the king of Babylon is not done. But this is where we have to be super careful with figurative language. We have to make sure we follow the storyteller's lead. We let the storyteller tell us whether or not we're talking about a human king. Is that what these figures of speech are referring to? Or is it referring to, as it is the case in Revelation 12, a satanic spirit, an evil spirit that is behind all the machinations and all the plans and the manipulations of these human powers and kings that arise? Let the storyteller guide you. Take the information, all of it. Now, don't just grab a verse out and say, oh, this sure looks like Satan, or this sure looks like this. Grab it all, look at it in context, follow it to its destination, gather as much data as you can, and then you'll be able to figure out if the figure of speech is referring to something concrete. Okay, I'm going to pause right there. Now, here's the deal. There's a little bit more we need to say. There's a little bit more we need to study on this, and we'll get to that next week. But it's really, really important. If a prophecy seems to be saying something clear and there's no figures of speech, just take it at face value. It is what it is. Talking about a king, he's talking about a man. He says the words king and man. It's most likely a king who's a man, all right? However, sometimes there are drops of hints all the time that say, no, and to understand this in a figurative way. If you do that, follow that down to its source. Get the right thing. Make sure you're pointing to the right concrete thing, because it's never just some thing that doesn't really have a meaning. No, every visual, every symbol is connected to something else, and it'll help you to understand, all right? Now, we'll talk more about this next week. Thank you for your time and your attention. We'll see you next week. Love you. Bye.